New York, the Gilded Age. On the edge of Manhattan, along the slow-moving waters of the Hudson River, a colossal mass of stone and marble once rose from the ground, a private palace so vast it overwhelmed the skyline around it, the largest personal residence the city had ever known. This was the Schwab Mansion. Its owner was a steel king, born poor, raised among furnaces and smoke, who climbed to the peak of American industry and chose to answer the world with excess. The house was larger than museums, louder than taste itself. Inside were ballrooms and winter gardens, a private theater, endless halls designed not for comfort, but for awe. Yet from the very beginning, something was wrong. The mansion stood in the wrong place. Old money ruled Fifth Avenue. That was where legitimacy lived. Riverside Drive, with its river views and open air, was scenery, not status. Society pages sneered. Newspapers mocked the house as nouveau riche indulgence. To New York's elite, it was a monument to bad taste. And behind those towering windows, the story was not only one of celebration, it was a story of isolation, of parties thrown to purchase respect, of a man who had everything and feared losing it all, of bills that never stopped coming, slowly gnawing away at a fortune built too fast. Then the unthinkable happened. Within a few decades, the largest palace New York had ever seen became something no one wanted. Too big to live in, too expensive to maintain, too symbolic of a past the city was eager to forget. Attempts were made to sell it, to rent it, to reduce it into something manageable. None of it worked. In the end, New York erased it. A house built to announce victory in life vanished as if it had never existed. How did a palace meant to prove success turn into a warning about the dangers of limitless wealth? And what, if anything, remains of the Schwab Mansion today? January 1948. A bitterly cold morning on Riverside Drive. Across the street, an elderly man stands at his apartment window. Below him, a wrecking ball hangs still in the winter air, suspended before the largest private residence the city has ever known. The Schwab Mansion. 75 rooms of French chateau grandeur, towers stretching toward a dull gray sky, stone walls waiting, silently, for their sentence to be carried out. Then the first blow falls. Stone shatters where stained glass windows once softened afternoon light. Dust erupts into the air. The sound rolls across the Hudson River, deep, hollow, violent, like the cracking of something far larger than masonry. It feels as if an entire era has been struck. On the sidewalk below, a small crowd gathers, coats pulled tight, breath fogging in the cold. They whisper about the man who built this palace, about how he died nearly penniless only years earlier, and about how the city never truly embraced his dream. But this story does not begin with destruction. It begins with hunger. Charles M. Schwab was born in Pennsylvania's coal country, into a world of noise, smoke, and relentless labor. He grew up watching men vanish into blackened mills at dawn and emerge broken at night, if they emerged at all. From an early age, he understood what it meant to be small, to be expendable, and he decided it would never happen to him. America's Industrial Revolution rewarded men willing to risk everything, and Schwab did exactly that. Steel became his ladder out of poverty. Wealth came quickly, then spectacularly. But money alone was not enough. The mansion he envisioned was never just a home, it was a declaration, a stone manifesto meant to prove that a Catholic boy from nowhere could stand among the Protestant aristocracy of New York and surpass them. When Schwab purchased an entire city block between 73rd and 74th Streets on Riverside Drive, old money families watched with barely concealed disdain. Everyone knew the rules. Fifth Avenue was power. Riverside Drive was the wrong side of prestige, the view side, not the status side. Schwab did not care. He hired architect Maurice Hebert and gave him a single instruction: build something that would make Andrew Carnegie's mansion look modest. Between 1902 and 1906, the site became a spectacle. Pink granite was imported and carved into towering forms inspired by the chateaux of France's Loire Valley. The cost crept towards $7 million at a time when the average American worker earned less than $500 a year. The finished mansion was almost unreal in scale. 75 rooms, a bowling alley, a gymnasium, a swimming pool, 3 elevators, its own private power plant, a winter garden where tropical plants flourished while snow piled up outside on Riverside Drive. The Schwab mansion did not whisper wealth, it screamed it. At the heart of the mansion stood the great hall. Its ceilings soared, its walls echoed, and at its center rose a massive pipe organ whose sound could roll through corridors and galleries like a slow-moving storm. Music did not simply fill the house, it possessed it. When Andrew Carnegie first visited, he stood beneath those vaulted ceilings and looked up in silence. Then, half amused and half stunned, he muttered, "Now my house looks like a shack." It was meant as praise, yet in hindsight the remark carried the weight of prophecy. Because the Schwab mansion held a flaw no marble, granite, or gold leaf could conceal. It stood in the wrong place. Fifth Avenue society never truly accepted Charles Schwab. The whispers never faded. Nouveau riche, steal money. Newspapers delighted in placing photographs of his palace beside stories of gambling in Monte Carlo, of extravagant travels, of a fast life that followed him from continent to continent. The mansion became less a home and more a headline. He hired architect Maurice Hebert and gave him a single instruction: build something that would make Andrew Carnegie's mansion look modest. Between 1902 and 1906, the site became a spectacle. Pink granite was imported and carved into towering forms inspired by the chateaux of France's Loire Valley. The cost crept towards $7 million at a time when the average American worker earned less than $500 a year. The finished mansion was almost unreal in scale. 75 rooms, a bowling alley, a gymnasium, a swimming pool, 3 elevators, its own private power plant, a winter garden where tropical plants flourished while snow piled up outside on Riverside Drive. The Schwab mansion did not whisper wealth, it screamed it. At the heart of the mansion stood the great hall. Its ceilings soared, its walls echoed, and at its center rose a massive pipe organ whose sound could roll through corridors and galleries like a slow-moving storm. Music did not simply fill the house, it possessed it. When Andrew Carnegie first visited, he stood beneath those vaulted ceilings and looked up in silence. Then, half amused and half stunned, he muttered, "Now my house looks like a shack." It was meant as praise, yet in hindsight the remark carried the weight of prophecy. Because the Schwab mansion held a flaw no marble, granite, or gold leaf could conceal. It stood in the wrong place. Fifth Avenue society never truly accepted Charles Schwab. The whispers never faded. Nouveau riche, steal money. Newspapers delighted in placing photographs of his palace beside stories of gambling in Monte Carlo, of extravagant travels, of a fast life that followed him from continent to continent. The mansion became less a home and more a headline.
Emma Schwab walked those endless halls and understood something her husband refused to face. The house was simply too large for 2 people with no children. Dozens of servants moved quietly through its rooms, yet the spaces felt empty, like a grand hotel that had somehow forgotten to invite its guests. Sound vanished into corners. Footsteps echoed too long. For nearly 20 years, Schwab tried to fill that emptiness with people and noise. Musicians performed beneath the organ pipes. Presidents, princes, and industrial titans passed through the doors. On winter nights, the mansion blazed with light, glowing above Riverside Drive like a landlocked ocean liner frozen in stone. But behind the spectacle, something was quietly decaying. When the stock market crashed in 1929, the steel industry collapsed with it. Fortunes that once felt permanent proved fragile. The man who could afford to heat 75 rooms now struggled to pay his property taxes. Maintenance alone became unbearable. Schwab searched desperately for a solution. He offered the mansion to the city as an official mayoral residence. Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia came in person, walking slowly through the marble halls, studying the vast rooms in silence. And when he finally spoke, his verdict sealed the building's fate. "What am I to do with that?" In the depths of the Great Depression, with millions struggling just to keep a roof over their heads, a politician living in such opulence was unthinkable. The city declined. No benefactor stepped forward. The palace remained, but its future quietly vanished. Emma died in 1939. Charles Schwab, broken in health and fortune, moved into a modest apartment. He never slept in his palace again. When he died later that same year, the numbers told a cruel story. His debts exceeded his assets. The man who once commanded billions left the world owing money.
The mansion lingered on without him. Its rooms were carved into apartments. Victory gardens replaced lawns where carriages once rolled in careful circles. Grandeur gave way to necessity. And then, in 1948, the wrecking ball arrived on Riverside Drive. Today, if you walk along the stretch between 73rd and 74th Streets, nothing seems remarkable. Just an ordinary apartment building called Schwab House. Dogs tug at leashes. Joggers pass with headphones in. Almost no one looks up. Almost no one imagines the towers that once pierced this same sky. The Schwab Mansion was the largest private home ever built in New York City. It survived less than half a century, and its disappearance leaves a question hanging in the air. What does it mean to build something so large that the world cannot or will not contain it? The photographs feel unreal. You stand at the corner of 73rd Street and Riverside Drive, holding a faded image from 1910. In the picture, a French chateau consumes the entire block. Towers and turrets, steep slate roofs, windows catching pale morning light. You lower the photograph. In front of you stands a plain red brick apartment building, 15 stories, identical windows, a doorman in a gray uniform, a woman walking a golden retriever. The same corner, the same coordinates, a completely different world. This is what remains of Charles Schwab's dream. A name on an awning, Schwab House. Most residents have no idea why their building carries that title. They know nothing of the palace that once stood here, of the music that flooded these streets, of the Steel King who believed he could purchase immortality in stone. The city erased him so completely that even his ghost would struggle to find the way home. And yet, ghosts always leave traces. If you know where to look, they are still there.
Walk south along Riverside Drive and watch how the blocks change. Most are divided into narrow parcels, pre-war apartment buildings pressed tightly together like books on an overcrowded shelf. But between 73rd and 74th Streets, the pattern breaks. There is only one structure. The footprint feels wrong, too wide, too generous for Manhattan's unforgiving mathematics of real estate. This is the scar tissue of Charles Schwab's ambition. When developers cleared the ruins in 1948, they inherited a plot so vast that only a single massive building could occupy it. The architecture forgot the mansion, but the proportions did not. The land remembers. Cross the street into Riverside Park. Find a bench facing west. This is roughly where Schwab himself would have stood on summer evenings, watching the sun sink behind the Palisades of New Jersey. The view has barely changed. The Hudson still catches copper and gold light at dusk. Sailboats still drift toward the harbor. The river breeze still carries the same cool promise. Schwab chose this site for that view. It was proof that new money could claim the same horizons as old money, could watch the same sunsets, could stand before the same river and feel equal to anyone who had ever lived on Fifth Avenue. The irony cuts deep. Schwab built on Riverside Drive because Fifth Avenue society rejected him. If they would not let him into their neighborhood, he would create one of his own, grander, louder, impossible to ignore. But in doing so, he fixed his outsider status in stone. The mansion was not only a triumph, it was a confession. Now pull out your phone. Search for historical photographs of the Schwab mansion and hold them up against the modern skyline. The overlap is unsettling. Where joggers pass today, carriages once lined a curving driveway. Where a doorman now stands, footmen in livery once greeted senators, financiers, and industrial titans. The Winter Garden, an indoor paradise of glass and tropical plants, occupied roughly the spot where a first-floor fitness center now hums with treadmills and elliptical machines. Scale is the hardest thing to grasp.
We are accustomed to large buildings in Manhattan, but Schwab's mansion was not vertical. It did not rise like a skyscraper. It spread outward, low and dominant, like a European estate dropped onto an American grid. Contemporary accounts describe pedestrians approaching from Broadway and stopping mid-step, unable to process what they were seeing. A French chateau sprawling across an entire city block. More land than many public parks. Imagine being a neighbor, living in a modest brownstone and watching month after month as workers hauled pink granite up Riverside Drive, watching towers rise where rows of tenements might have stood, watching one man's ego quietly redraw the outline of your skyline. The emotion must have been mixed, wonder tangled with resentment. And yet, the mansion also brought something the neighborhood had never known: prestige. Property values along Riverside Drive climbed throughout the 1910s. Other wealthy families, encouraged by Schwab's audacity, began building their own grand homes nearby. For a brief, glittering moment, the so-called wrong side of Central Park seemed poised to rival Fifth Avenue itself. That moment did not last. The Great Depression crushed Riverside Drive's ambitions along with Schwab's fortune. Grand houses became boarding homes. Elegant apartments were subdivided into smaller units. Wealth retreated east, back to its traditional strongholds. The West Side settled into a different identity, more bohemian, more middle class, more forgiving of eccentricity and experiment. Today, Riverside Drive is beautiful but not fashionable, calm but not prestigious. It has made a quiet peace with its past. Yet beneath the pavement, beneath the foundations of Schwab House, fragments of the original mansion may still lie buried. Archaeologists have never opened the ground here. No one knows what the wrecking crews left behind when they cleared the rubble. Carved stones, shattered tiles, pieces of a world that vanished within a single generation. The ghost block keeps its secrets.
We do not need archaeology to understand what happened on this corner. We only need to follow the money, follow the ambition, follow a young man from the coal fields of Pennsylvania as he climbs toward a fortune powerful enough to build an empire and hungry enough to consume it. Charles Schwab's story does not begin in Manhattan. It begins far from marble halls and river views, in a small town called Williamsburg, Pennsylvania, and in the long shadow of Andrew Carnegie, the Scotsman who would teach him everything about steel and almost nothing about restraint. Williamsburg, Pennsylvania. Not the fashionable Brooklyn neighborhood, but a modest town tucked into the Allegheny Mountains, where the air tasted of coal dust and the rivers ran brown with industrial runoff. This was a working landscape, shaped by labor and survival, not aspiration. Here, on February 18, 1862, Charles Michael Schwab was born, the first of 4 children to John and Pauline Schwab. The family lived on the margins of American society. They were Catholic in a Protestant region, German-speaking in an English world, poor in an era when poverty meant something harsher than inconvenience. It meant constant risk. John Schwab worked first as a weaver, then as a livery stable keeper. Honest trades, respectable trades, but trades that offered no safety net, no cushion against bad luck or illness. Young Charles grew up understanding how thin the line was between getting by and going under. But he also grew up watching something extraordinary unfold just miles from home. Western Pennsylvania was becoming the engine room of a new American economy. The steel industry transformed the region almost overnight. Blast furnaces lit the night sky orange. Railroads spread across the hills like metal veins. Men who had been farmers 1 generation earlier now fed ore into machines that produced the bones of bridges, the skeletons of skyscrapers, the rails that stitched a continent together.
The noise never stopped. The heat was relentless. The labor was brutal. But the opportunity was real, if you knew how to seize it. Charles Schwab intended to seize it. At 17, he talked his way into a job at Andrew Carnegie's Edgar Thomson Steel Works in Braddock, Pennsylvania. His first position was as humble as it gets, a stake driver in the engineering department, earning $1 a day. Yet Schwab possessed 2 qualities more valuable than any technical skill. First, he could do mathematics in his head faster than most men could manage on paper. Costs, outputs, efficiencies, numbers made sense to him instinctively. Second, he could talk to anyone. Foremen, laborers, executives. He spoke with a warmth that made each person feel seen, important, remembered. It was not charm in the shallow sense, it was attention, and attention was rare. Carnegie noticed him. The Scottish immigrant who would become the richest man in America had a gift for recognizing ambition because he had once lived it himself. In Schwab, he saw something unsettlingly familiar: hunger that did not fade with success, ambition that treated every obstacle as an invitation. Schwab rose with breathtaking speed. Within 6 months, he was transferred fully into engineering. Within 2 years, he became a superintendent. By the age of 25, he was running the Homestead Steel Works, one of the largest and most profitable steel plants on Earth. The pace of his ascent bordered on absurd. Men twice his age, with decades more experience, found themselves reporting to a smooth-talking kid from Williamsburg. Some resented him. Many could not help admiring him. Schwab arrived before dawn and left after dark. He memorized the names of workers' wives and children. He remembered birthdays. When company rewards felt insufficient, he reached into his own pocket to distribute bonuses.
This was not simple manipulation, or perhaps it was manipulation so open and sincere that it ceased to feel like manipulation at all.
Schwab genuinely liked people. He found their stories interesting, their problems worthy of his time. In an industry defined by violence and confrontation, where strikes were crushed with bullets and union organizers simply disappeared, Schwab represented something almost unheard of, a boss workers did not hate. Carnegie understood the value of this. He had built his empire through efficiency and ruthlessness, but he knew steel was ultimately made by human beings, and human beings worked harder for leaders they trusted. In Charles Schwab, Carnegie found the perfect instrument, someone who could extract maximum productivity without provoking maximum resentment. It was a partnership that would reshape American industry and quietly, inevitably, set the stage for excess on a scale few had ever imagined. By 1897, Charles Schwab had reached a height few men ever touched. He was president of Carnegie Steel. He was 35 years old. The position made him wealthy beyond anything his father could have imagined, beyond anything the boy from coal country had once dared to picture. But for Schwab, money was never the destination. It was evidence, proof that he had escaped the gravity of poverty, proof that his name now carried weight. The problem with proof is that it never satisfies for long. Each milestone demanded a greater one. Every success whispered that failure was still possible. The higher he climbed, the more terrifying the fall became. Schwab lived with that fear constantly, even at the summit. Andrew Carnegie understood that hunger because he carried it himself. But Carnegie had learned something Schwab had not: when to stop. In 1901, Carnegie sold his steel empire to J.P. Morgan for $480 million, the largest business transaction the world had ever seen. Then he turned his back on accumulation. He spent the rest of his life trying to give his fortune away. Libraries, universities, foundations. He raced toward the end, determined to die as close to poor as a rich man could manage. Schwab drew a very different lesson. He watched what money could build. He saw Carnegie's mansions rise in Manhattan and in Scotland. He attended dinners where the guest lists read like a census of American power. And he decided that he would build something even greater. Not to donate, not to disperse, but to keep. A monument. A palace that would announce, in stone and slate and glass, that Charles Schwab of Williamsburg, Pennsylvania, had arrived. The land on Riverside Drive was waiting. The architects were available. The only real question was whether a fortune forged in steel could support a dream poured entirely out of pride. The year was 1901. Charles Schwab stood on an empty block stretching from 73rd to 74th Street along Riverside Drive, watching the Hudson River shimmer in the pale autumn light. To the west, the water caught the sun. To the east lay Central Park, and beyond its trees, the limestone palaces of Fifth Avenue, where the Vanderbilts and Astors held court. They had never truly invited him into that world, not in the way that mattered. To them, he was still steel money, still new, still not quite acceptable. So Schwab made a decision. If he could not enter their neighborhood, he would build his own kingdom, right here, on what they dismissed as the wrong side of the park. The land already carried a history, though not one Schwab was eager to celebrate. For decades, the block had housed an orphan asylum, a grim institutional building where abandoned children slept in long rows beneath bare ceilings. When the asylum relocated, the structure was torn down. The site was left vacant, burdened by memory rather than promise. Schwab saw something else entirely.
Flush with his share of the Carnegie steel sale, he purchased the entire block for approximately $865,000. Then he began searching for an architect. His choice shocked New York society. Instead of hiring a celebrated firm like McKim, Mead & White, Schwab selected Maurice Hébert, a talented but relatively unknown designer trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. The decision was intentional. Schwab did not want an architect with a competing vision. He wanted someone who would execute his.
The instructions were simple and ruthless. Study the great chateaux of France's Loire Valley, Chenonceau, Chambord, Azay-le-Rideau. Take their finest elements and fuse them into something new, something unprecedented, something that would make the mansions of Fifth Avenue look, by comparison, like respectable townhouses. Hébert understood the assignment. Construction began in 1902 and continued for 4 relentless years. At its peak, more than 600 workers labored on the site. Stonemasons from Italy, carpenters from Germany, ironworkers drawn from across the eastern seaboard. They arrived before dawn, climbed scaffolding that seemed to scrape the sky, and spent their days turning raw stone, timber, and steel into a fantasy one man would call home. The scale defied belief. 75 rooms, 40 bathrooms, a basement level containing a bowling alley, a gymnasium, and a swimming pool lined with hand-painted Italian tiles. Pink granite was hauled through the streets and carved into towers and turrets. Slate roofs rose at steep theatrical angles. Every surface declared permanence. Every detail insisted on importance. This was not a house designed to shelter a family. It was a statement, built on the edge of Manhattan, aimed squarely at the city that had never fully accepted its owner. 3 elevators served the mansion, mechanical marvels at a time when most New Yorkers still trusted their own legs more than steel cables. A private electrical plant ensured that the lights would never depend on the city's unreliable grid. And in the great hall stood a pipe organ so powerful its music could spill out through open windows and drift across Riverside Drive. Luxury was everywhere. Details whispered of European aristocracy. Carved limestone facades, steep slate roofs imported from France, towers rising nearly 75 feet above street level. A sweeping porte cochere allowed carriages to deliver guests directly beneath a marble entrance hall, sheltered from wind and rain. Wrought iron gates bore the Schwab family crest, a crest Charles Schwab commissioned specifically for the house because his family had never possessed an ancestral coat of arms. This was the paradox at the heart of the project. Schwab wanted a mansion that looked centuries old, a chateau that suggested generations of inherited wealth, tradition, and polish. Yet every stone announced the opposite. This was new money straining to look ancient. The house was a costume, and New York society understood exactly the role it was trying to play. The workers did not concern themselves with symbolism. They cared about wages, about safety, about the daily labor of raising a palace from Manhattan bedrock. Contemporary accounts say almost nothing about their lives. History rarely remembers the names of those who build monuments for others, but their days are easy to imagine. Granite blocks biting into gloved hands, dust clinging to lungs and clothing, wind cutting across scaffolding high above Riverside Drive. The constant knowledge that a single misstep could turn an ordinary workday into catastrophe. Many of these men likely returned each night to Lower East Side tenements, to rooms smaller than Schwab's planned closets. Every morning they crossed the city to the Upper West Side, spent the day constructing luxury they would never experience, then went home to apartments without running water or proper heat. This was the arithmetic of the Gilded Age. Some men dreamed in marble, other men made those dreams solid for about $1 a day. By 1906, the mansion was complete. Final cost estimates ranged between $6 and $7 million. Newspapers printed the figures again and again, with a mixture of awe and unease. For that sum, New York could have built dozens of schools or hundreds of affordable housing units. Instead, it produced a single private residence for one man, his wife, and their household staff. The opening was less a party than a procession. New York's elite arrived one by one to see what Charles Schwab had summoned out of stone and steel, and to decide whether he had finally purchased his way into their world. They crossed the threshold into the marble entrance hall, climbed the grand staircase beneath towering chandeliers, paused in the winter garden where tropical plants bloomed year-round in carefully controlled warmth while snow fell silently outside. And everywhere they whispered. The whispers lasted for weeks. New York society had seen great houses before, the Vanderbilt palaces along Fifth Avenue, the Astor strongholds, the Morgan Library, but nothing had prepared them for Riverside Drive. As carriages rolled up to Schwab's housewarming reception in the spring of 1906, even the most jaded aristocrats fell quiet. The chateau rose before them like a structure transplanted from another century, another continent. Towers caught the last light of sunset. Windows glowed with the soft amber of electric chandeliers, still a novelty in private homes, still a signal of wealth powerful enough to illuminate the night at will. Inside, scale did the real talking. The entrance hall alone could have swallowed a modest brownstone. Marble floors reflected light from crystal fixtures imported from Vienna. A grand staircase swept upward in a curve so precise it felt almost weightless. Every balustrade carved with acanthus leaves and cherubs, every surface polished to announce permanence. This was not simply a home opening its doors. It was a question posed to the city itself. Had Charles Schwab finally arrived? Or had he built something so grand that it only confirmed what New York already believed, that no matter how high new money climbed, it would always be seen as an outsider wearing borrowed history? The palace stood ready to host 1,000 conversations, but it could not answer the one that mattered most. Guests ascended to the second floor and stepped into a long gallery lined with paintings, old masters Schwab had hunted down at auctions across Europe. Their gilded frames burned gold against walls draped in silk damask, each canvas silently announcing knowledge, taste, and money refined enough to recognize both. But the true spectacle waited beyond, the great hall. This was the heart of the mansion, a room conceived not for comfort, but for awe. Its ceiling soared so high it vanished into shadow, leaving visitors instinctively lowering their voices as if they had entered a sacred space. At one end stood the pipe organ, more than 2,000 pipes hidden behind carved wooden screens, capable of filling the hall with sound closer to a cathedral than a private residence. Schwab hired professional organists to perform during dinner parties. Music swelled between courses, rolling through the room and down adjoining corridors, transforming meals into something resembling religious services, a liturgy devoted to wealth. On that first evening, Handel filled the air as guests sipped champagne and drifted through rooms that seemed to multiply endlessly. A library paneled in rare woods, a billiard room with tables imported from England, a winter garden where palm trees and orchids flourished beneath a glass ceiling, thriving in carefully regulated warmth while winter pressed against the windows outside. Servants in formal livery appeared and vanished through hidden doors, balancing silver trays, refilling glasses, adjusting details before anyone needed to ask. The choreography was flawless, invisible labor sustaining visible luxury. Charles Schwab moved through the house like a conductor leading an orchestra.
He greeted every guest by name, recalled details from earlier conversations, and made introductions designed to flatter both sides. He radiated triumph. Emma Schwab remained closer to the edges. She smiled when expected. She said precisely the right thing at precisely the right moment. Yet those who knew her sensed something restrained in her expression. Not pride, not discomfort, something quieter, watchful, as if she were waiting for a bill that had not yet arrived. Andrew Carnegie arrived late, as befitted his stature. The old Scotsman was 70 now, retired from business and deep into his mission to give away his fortune before death. He walked slowly through the marble entrance hall, paused at the foot of the grand staircase, and looked up. The room fell silent. Then Carnegie turned to his former protégé and delivered a line that would echo through New York drawing rooms for years to come. "Charlie, now my house looks like a shack." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Schwab beamed. On the surface, the remark was pure praise, confirmation that the student had surpassed the master, at least in scale and spectacle. But beneath the joke lay something sharper. Carnegie had built his fortune through discipline and restraint. He lived well, but he also gave relentlessly. His buildings, grand as they were, often served the public. Libraries, concert halls, institutions meant to outlast him. Schwab's chateau served only Schwab. The newspapers noticed. Reviews of the mansion mixed admiration with unease. One columnist called it the most magnificent private residence in America, then wondered in the same breath whether such magnificence was decent in an age when thousands slept in tenements. Another praised the craftsmanship, but questioned the taste. Too French, too theatrical, too obviously built to impress. Schwab brushed aside the criticism. He had created exactly what he intended. The parties continued through that first season and into the next. Opera singers performed beneath the organ pipes. Politicians maneuvered for invitations. Industrialists toured the rooms and returned home faintly unsettled, aware they had been outdone. But Emma Schwab saw what her husband did not. The rooms were too large for two people. Their footsteps echoed in corridors designed for crowds. They had no children to fill the nursery, no heirs waiting to inherit paintings or silver. The staff outnumbered the family by a margin that bordered on absurd. Dozens of servants maintaining a house for a couple who spent half their lives on trains and steamships. At night, when the guests were gone and the organ fell silent, Emma walked through the empty halls alone. She passed door after door, room after room, each one perfect, each one hollow. She searched for the right word: a home, a monument, a trap. She never spoke these doubts aloud. Charles was too exhilarated, too proud, too convinced that the mansion proved everything he had ever needed to prove. For now, the palace stood glowing above Riverside Drive, alive with music, voices, and light. And beneath all of it, the quiet question waited. But the question did not fade. It lingered in the air like dust suspended in the winter garden, settling slowly, invisibly onto every surface. In the next chapter, we follow the Schwabs through 2 decades inside their palace and watch as the emptiness Emma sensed begins to exact its quiet price.
The emptiness Emma sensed did not disappear. It grew. By 1910, the Schwab mansion had settled into a rhythm, but not the rhythm of a home. It moved like an institution, a finely tuned machine of wealth and order, humming long before its owners woke and continuing long after they slept. Each morning began before dawn in the basement kitchens. Cooks moved through pools of lamplight, preparing breakfast for a household that barely gathered together. Coffee percolated in silver urns. Eggs arrived daily from an upstate farm contracted to serve only the wealthiest families. Bread was delivered fresh from a private baker. Fruit came from greenhouses that stayed warm and bright through New York winters, defying the season outside. The staff numbered between 40 and 50, depending on the time of year. Housekeepers dusted rooms no one entered for weeks. Footmen polished silver that rested untouched in cabinets between parties. Groundskeepers tended lawns and gardens seen almost exclusively by the Schwabs and the people paid to maintain them. A private secretary managed Charles's constant stream of letters and telegrams. A social secretary curated Emma's calendar. An engineer monitored the private electrical plant. A chauffeur waited beside automobiles that had replaced the carriages of earlier years. A small army moving efficiently through a hidden skeleton of corridors and staircases. The house was designed this way. Service passages ran behind walls, beneath floors, above ceilings, architecture engineered to make labor invisible. The hierarchy was built into the stone itself. The Schwabs lived in sunlit rooms overlooking the Hudson. Those who sustained their lives existed in shadows, emerging only when summoned. Emma treated the staff well. Contemporary accounts describe her as kind, even generous. She remembered birthdays, asked after families, arranged medical care when illness struck. But kindness could not erase the strangeness of the arrangement. She was a woman from a modest Pennsylvania background, now presiding over a household larger than some hotels. The role never quite settled on her shoulders. She filled her days with the expected duties of a Gilded Age wife: charity committees, luncheons with society women, visits to galleries and concert halls. She redecorated rooms that did not need redecorating, ordered flowers that wilted before anyone truly enjoyed them, planned elaborate dinners Charles often missed, delayed by office demands or pulled overseas by business. For long stretches, the mansion, despite all its grandeur, was missing the man who had built it. Charles Schwab had not constructed a home meant for quiet living. He had built a stage. When guests filled the great hall, when the organ thundered and champagne sparkled in crystal, the chateau made sense. It justified itself through spectacle. But spectacle requires an audience, and audiences always leave. In the long afternoons and early mornings, stripped of music and conversation, the mansion revealed its true nature. It felt less like shelter and more like a monument, a stone testament to ambition, not a place designed for ordinary human life. Schwab himself seemed allergic to stillness. He traveled constantly, to Europe for business and pleasure, to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where his steel empire operated, to Washington, where influence was cultivated in private rooms. When he was home, he worked. When he was not working, he entertained. The idea of simply existing within his own house, reading by the fire, walking the grounds with Emma, barely fit his character. Emma adapted. She carved out a smaller world within the larger one, a suite of rooms on the upper floors where life felt human in scale. She built routines that did not depend on her husband's presence. She found comfort in a small circle of friends who visited regularly, women who understood that wealth did not guarantee happiness, and who never dismissed her doubts as ingratitude.
The doubts remained. The couple had no children, no footsteps racing down hallways, no voices filling rooms built to echo, no future heirs waiting to inherit the art, the silver, the story. The palace stood complete, immaculately maintained, and strangely unfinished. A house full of people, and yet, so often, empty. Whether by choice or by circumstance, the record remains silent, but the absence shaped everything. The nursery on the third floor stood fully furnished and untouched, a suite prepared for a future that never arrived. Children's bedrooms waited with neatly made beds. A schoolroom held desks that never felt the scratch of pencils. A playroom sat frozen in anticipation. Emma sometimes walked through these rooms alone, her hand drifting across the backs of empty chairs, imagining laughter that never echoed, footsteps that never raced down the hall. The silence there felt heavier than anywhere else in the house. Charles never spoke of it. Instead, he redirected his paternal instincts outward. At Bethlehem Steel, he became a father figure to thousands. He gave speeches about loyalty and discipline. He handed out turkeys at Christmas. He funded scholarships for workers' children and praised the virtues of family in factory yards and boardrooms alike. The company became the dynasty the mansion could never hold. Where the nursery remained empty, the steel mills filled with sons by the thousands. And so the years passed. The mansion hosted presidents. William Howard Taft walked its halls. Warren Harding followed. Musicians performed beneath the vaulted ceilings of the Great Hall. Charity galas raised fortunes for hospitals and orphanages. The Schwab name appeared again and again in society pages, always paired with words like elegance, generosity, taste. Behind the photographs and polished descriptions, the reality was quieter and sadder. Two people moving through 75 rooms, each in their own private orbit, each wondering in their own way whether any of it had been worth the cost. In the next chapter, we follow Charles Schwab beyond the mansion walls, into the casinos and scandals that would slowly unravel everything he had built.
The casinos of Monte Carlo knew him by name. Each winter, Charles Schwab arrived on the French Riviera like a migrating bird, drawn instinctively toward warmer waters and higher stakes. He crossed Europe in private railroad cars, surrounded by valets and secretaries carrying enough cash to steady a small government treasury. At the gaming tables, croupiers greeted him with the reverence reserved for men who could lose fortunes without blinking. And Schwab, for all his brilliance in business, could never resist the spin of the wheel. His gambling was no secret. Newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic chronicled his appearances in Monte Carlo with a blend of fascination and moral alarm. In 1902, Andrew Carnegie publicly rebuked his former protege after reports surfaced of spectacular losses. Schwab apologized, promised reform, and returned the following season. The cycle would repeat for decades. But the roulette wheel was only the most visible symptom. Schwab lived fast because stillness frightened him. He worked 18-hour days and then chased pleasures intense enough to drown out the noise inside his own mind. Fine wines, multi-course dinners in Europe's best restaurants, the company of beautiful women who were not his wife. Rumors followed him across borders, of affairs, of discreetly rented apartments, of a second life unfolding far from Riverside Drive. Emma heard the whispers. It would have been impossible not to. New York society thrived on gossip, and her husband supplied it generously. Yet she never confronted him in public, never threatened divorce, never staged the dramatic scenes tabloids would have devoured. Whether her silence came from dignity, denial, or sheer exhaustion, the record does not say. She stayed. She managed the household, attended the necessary functions, played the role expected of her, while her husband played very different roles elsewhere. The distance between public image and private reality widened with each passing year. In speeches and interviews, Schwab presented himself as a devoted family man and benevolent captain of industry. He called his workers his boys, his company his family, his mansion proof that the American dream rewarded hard work and moral living. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. But in the Gilded Age, selective truth was practically a professional requirement. His business decisions began to reflect the same recklessness that ruled his personal life. At Bethlehem Steel, Schwab placed bold bets that sometimes paid off brilliantly and sometimes came close to disaster. He expanded capacity on optimistic forecasts. He clashed with cautious board members who urged restraint. The fast lane that thrilled him in Monte Carlo had followed him home, and it would not forgive mistakes forever. He poured company money into projects that served his ego as much as the bottom line, including a bold but doomed plan to build the largest office building in the world. The pattern was unmistakable. Schwab struggled to distinguish confidence from overconfidence. The same drive that had lifted him from stake driver to steel baron now blinded him to dangers that more cautious men saw with ease. He had gambled his way from poverty to unimaginable wealth, and he could not stop gambling, even when the stakes involved thousands of jobs and the survival of his empire. World War I briefly transformed that appetite for risk into an asset. Bethlehem Steel secured enormous contracts to supply the Allied powers with munitions, armor plate, and ships. Factories roared, profits surged, and Schwab's personal fortune ballooned once more. For a time, the mansion on Riverside Drive seemed to have found a new script. Victory parties celebrated the armistice. Generals, diplomats, and industrialists ascended the grand staircase to toast the end of war. Schwab received their praise in the great hall, the organ piping triumphal chords, and for a fleeting moment it seemed that his habit of doubling down had been vindicated. But luck is a poor substitute for a plan. The 1920s glittered, but quietly, inexorably, they set the stage for a reckoning. Schwab moved through the decade as he had the ones before, traveling, entertaining, gambling, working. The mansion itself seemed to adapt to the era. Jazz orchestras replaced string quartets. The rhythms of the roaring 20s filled the great hall. Prohibition made alcohol illegal, yet for a man with Schwab's connections, the law was more inconvenience than obstacle. Champagne arrived discreetly through private channels. Whiskey flowed in crystal decanters, defying the Volstead Act, as if it were an unimportant footnote. The stock market soared. Paper wealth climbed with it. Schwab, 60, then 65, remained convinced the party would never end. Emma watched from her private rooms on the upper floors. Older now, quieter, her health beginning to falter, she wandered the halls in a mansion that no longer felt merely too large. It had become a mausoleum of memory, magnificent, cold, and patient, waiting for the story to turn. She filled her hours with reading, letters to old friends, reflections on the modest Pennsylvania towns where she and Charles had begun life before steel and stone and chandeliers reshaped their world. She could not have known what was coming. None of them could. October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday. Panic swallowed the trading floor. Men who had been millionaires at breakfast were ruined by lunch. Stocks that had climbed for years collapsed in hours. Ticker machines sputtered, unable to keep up with the freefall. Outside the New York Stock Exchange, crowds gathered in near silence, eyes fixed on the doors through which fortunes vanished. On Riverside Drive, the Schwab mansion remained still. No parties that week, no organ music drifting through the soaring great hall. Charles Schwab, 67, understood immediately what younger men refused to accept. This was not a correction. This was an ending. The crash did not obliterate him overnight. Unlike speculators who had borrowed against paper wealth, Schwab's fortune was largely real: steel mills, factories, machinery. But steel is only valuable when someone needs it. In the months after Black Tuesday, demand thinned to nearly nothing. Construction projects froze across America. Railroads shelved plans for new tracks. Automakers slashed production. The skyscrapers that had climbed over Manhattan and Chicago, symbols of the same optimism that had built Schwab's chateau, stopped mid-rise like dreams frozen in concrete and steel. The mansion itself seemed the change. Its great doors no longer opened to applause. Its organ no longer filled the halls with music.
Winter light fell coldly across marble floors. In the distance, the Hudson shimmered indifferently, uncaring whether fortunes rose or fell. Inside, two people moved silently through 75 rooms. The empty nursery on the third floor remained untouched, a monument to futures that would never arrive. Outside, the city they had sought to master began to master them in turn. Charles Schwab had built an empire in steel and a palace to match, but on Black Tuesday, both began their slow, inexorable descent. The mansion, once a stage for triumph and spectacle, became a quiet witness to the fragility of fortune and to the truth that no amount of marble, glass, or chandeliers could protect a man from history's reckoning. The steel skeletons of the nation's industry stood bare against winter skies, a stark reminder that no empire is immune to gravity. Bethlehem Steel stock, once peaking above $140 per share, began a long, cruel slide that would scrape the bottom in single digits. On paper, Charles Schwab watched his fortune unravel. Paper losses became real, immediate, undeniable when the bills arrived. And the mansion, the palace that had once announced his triumph to the world, devoured money with a hunger that no ledger could satisfy. Property taxes alone surpassed $50,000 a year, enough to purchase several modest Manhattan homes outright. The staff, dozens strong, expected salaries regardless of Wall Street's whims. Coal burned through the enormous heating system by the ton. Roof tiles cracked under frost. Pipes corroded. Carved stone weathered and demanded constant repair. Even the gardens, the winter garden, the lawns, the flower beds, insisted on constant spending, a living proof that luxury costs more than admiration. Schwab began selling first the paintings. Old masters slipped quietly from the mansion, shipped to auctions in the hope that absence would not become scandal. Then the automobiles, then pieces of silver, then furniture Emma had spent decades curating. Each sale bought only a temporary reprieve. The mansion's appetite remained insatiable, consuming cash faster than he could turn objects into liquidity. He tried to borrow. Banks that had once vied for his signature now demanded collateral he no longer possessed. Reputation, once untouchable, fortified by clever charm, whispered rumors of gambling and affairs, and relentless ambition, could not survive the simple arithmetic of insolvency. Charles Schwab, the boy from Williamsburg who had risen to command United States Steel and then Bethlehem Steel, was running out of cash. The staff noticed first. Salaries arrived late, then later, then stopped entirely. Senior servants who had spent decades polishing the marble quietly sought work elsewhere. The army of 40 shrank to 30, then 20, then fewer still. Rooms once luminous under daily attention gathered dust. The winter garden, starved of warmth, surrendered its tropical plants one frost at a time. Emma's health faltered alongside the household. Now in her 70s, she bore the weight of a home that had never fully felt like hers. Doctors visited with increasing frequency. Nurses were hired, then dismissed as funds ran dry. Most of her life now unfolded in the small suite she had carved years earlier, a corner of humanity inside a mansion built for spectacle. Charles tried to keep up appearances. Impeccable suits, attending society events, speeches praising American resilience, optimism, and the certainty of recovery. Yet those closest to him could see the strain beneath the polish. His charm, once effortless, felt rehearsed. His optimism rang thin. The man who had commanded rooms, who had bent colleagues and competitors alike to his will, now seemed to be seeking permission from the very spaces he had once mastered. The nadir came in 1933. Desperate to escape the relentless costs, Schwab offered the mansion to New York City as a residence for the mayor. Humiliation hung heavy in the air. The palace, built to prove he had arrived, now dangled as a gift simply to relieve its burden. He framed the proposal as civic generosity, a donation for the people of New York. The city knew the truth. Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia came in person, short, rumpled, incorruptible, a man of principle rather than vanity. He walked slowly through the marble halls, stood in the great hall beneath the pipe organ, silent now, ventured into the winter garden where frost-bitten palms and orchids leaned toward their inevitable end, and then, with the blunt clarity of a man who measured both politics and propriety, he spoke. "What? Me and that?" The words echoed, ricocheting through New York society like a verdict. LaGuardia was not cruel, he was practical. Millions were unemployed, tens of thousands were losing homes. No elected official could move into a 75-room chateau without inviting public rage. The mansion had become unsellable, ungiftable, unloved. The gilded monument that had once declared triumph now stood as an albatross of debt and expectation. In the weeks that followed, the palace's fate grew inevitable. Rooms once echoing with music and laughter fell silent. Gardens went untended. Staff dwindled. The Schwab's private empire of stone, steel, and ambition began its slow transformation into something unrecognizable. The city they had sought to impress had turned away, indifferent, leaving the mansion to shrink under its own weight. In the next chapter, we follow the palace as it descends into obscurity, fragmented into apartments, stripped of grandeur, and witness the quiet fading of the man who had built and lost it all. A king dethroned, not by revolution, but by the relentless arithmetic of reality.
Fiorello LaGuardia had built his career on speaking for ordinary New Yorkers, immigrants pressed into overcrowded tenements, laborers scraping survival while grand palaces sat half-empty on the Upper West Side. When he toured the Schwab mansion in 1933, walked slowly through the marble halls and delivered his verdict, "What, me in that?" he was not mocking Charles Schwab personally. He was stating a truth Schwab could not yet face aloud. The Gilded Age was over. Its monuments no longer proclaimed triumph. They had become liabilities. LaGuardia understood exactly what would happen if he accepted the gift. Photographers would swarm the grand staircase. Newspapers would print images of a mayor presiding over 75 rooms while bread lines snaked through the streets. Opponents would turn the chateau into a symbol of inequality, the excesses of an America that had forgotten the vast majority. The house Schwab had built to prove his success would destroy anyone foolish enough to live in it. So LaGuardia said no. From that moment, the mansion's fate was sealed. Schwab retreated into silence. The man who had once charmed presidents, influenced industrial policy, and commanded empires of steel began avoiding reporters, declining invitations, disappearing from the society pages that had followed him for decades. He was 71, exhausted, watching his lifetime of ambition crumble, room by room, marble by marble. Emma passed quietly in April 1939, 77 years old. She died in the mansion she had never fully called home, cared for by the skeleton crew of servants who still kept the house minimally functioning. Newspapers ran short, careful obituaries: wife of the industrialist, gracious hostess, patron of charitable causes. Nothing of the decades of loneliness, the echoing corridors, the quiet despair of walking through empty rooms. No mention of the husband whose body was present, but whose spirit was often elsewhere. Charles did not linger in the mansion after her death. He could not. The rooms that had carried her laughter, her careful touch, the soft rustle of her dresses, every corner reminded him of what he had lost. He moved into a modest apartment in a residential hotel on Park Avenue. Simple furniture, small rooms, muted walls, the opposite of everything he had spent decades constructing. The chateau remained largely empty, but not abandoned. A handful of caretakers made rounds, patching leaks, sweeping marble, watering what little life remained in the winter garden. But the great hall no longer trembled with organ music. The pool lay drained, its Italian tiles cracked.
Dust gathered on floors that once gleamed under the hands of dozens of housekeepers. Room by room, the mansion decayed, an empire of stone quietly giving way to entropy. Schwab's health followed the same inexorable slide. The man who had seemed powered by an internal engine that ignored late nights, long meals, and non-stop travel now shrank under the weight of years, worry, and defeat. Friends who visited his Park Avenue rooms noticed conversations that looped back on themselves, recollections that failed to line up, a mind once sharp, now fraying. The charm, once effortless, flickered like candlelight in a storm. The titan of steel now seemed a man asking permission of the rooms he once commanded. He died on September 18, 1939, barely 5 months after Emma. The timing felt almost merciful, as if he had waited to follow her into the quiet beyond. Obituaries were long but careful, celebrating the boy from Williamsburg who rose to industrial heights, his contributions to steel, his role in wartime production. The Riverside Drive mansion was mentioned in passing, palatial, famous, magnificent, but the newspapers did not dwell on his debts, his gambling, or the empire that had quietly slipped.
Through his fingers, death, in its finality, granted him the respectability life had withheld. Yet death could not save the estate. Lawyers opening his books confirmed what those closest had long suspected. Charles M. Schwab, once the king of steel, left debts exceeding his assets. Exact numbers varied by report, but some estimates placed the shortfall above $300,000, a staggering sum at the time. The largest private home ever built in New York City was no longer his. The mansion, once a symbol of triumph, now belonged only to history and memory, its corridors echoing with a silence heavier than any. The Schwab mansion, once a monument to ambition and excess, had long outlived the man who built it. Ownership had shifted through careful legal maneuvers meant to shield assets from creditors, but paperwork could not alter reality. In Depression-era New York, few wanted a 75-room chateau. Taxes piled up like snow in winter. Decay crept over carved stone and slate, and the house, once alive with music, laughter, and the rustle of silk damask, grew quiet, empty. A hulking relic of a Gilded Age that no longer existed. By the early 1940s, new owners, investors who had purchased the property for a fraction of its original cost, made a decision that would have horrified Charles Schwab. They would convert the mansion into a boarding house. The palace of a steel king would be transformed into housing for ordinary New Yorkers, people who needed 4 walls and a roof far more than they needed marble staircases or pipe organs. The work was rapid and unsentimental. Walls rose where none had been planned. The soaring Great Hall, once the site of organ concerts and presidential receptions, was carved into multiple apartments. Dressing rooms became kitchens. Bedrooms that had once held European masterworks now contained beds, chairs, and desks that dwarfed the space, but filled it with life. The winter garden, that glass-ceilinged paradise of palms and orchids, was chopped into tiny units that no longer caught the sunlight or whispered with tropical fragrance. Every pipe laid, every doorway cut, erased a fragment of Schwab's dream. The residents arrived. Teachers, clerks, young couples embarking on their first homes, war widows stretching limited pensions. They carried furniture in suitcases that would have seemed absurd in Schwab's original vision, yet now fit perfectly into their subdivided apartments. They climbed the same grand staircase that once impressed Vanderbilts, Astors, and industrial magnates, not to enter gilded halls, but to reach third-floor walk-ups with shared bathrooms. The irony was sharp and poetic. A monument built to escape poverty now sheltered people not so different from Schwab's own parents, people for whom a doorbell, 4 walls, and a modest kitchen were the truest luxury. Life inside the converted mansion was practical, occasionally eerie.
Residents whispered of footsteps echoing through empty corridors, doors opening without touch, sudden chills in rooms that should have been warm. Ghosts, or merely the groans and creaks of a building restructured beyond its original design. No one could say, yet the stories spread. The mansion gained a new legend, one rooted not in wealth and ambition, but in shared experience and imagination. The grounds transformed in kind. Lawns that had been immaculately maintained by gardeners were now victory gardens, rows of tomatoes and beans planted by residents contributing to the war effort. Laundry lines stretched where carriages had once glided across marble driveways. Children ran tag through terraces that had once hosted champagne receptions, their laughter echoing off stone walls that had only known the clink of crystal glasses. Schwab's palace, built for spectacle and status, had become a monument to necessity, to resilience, to life lived at human scale.
Not everyone welcomed the change. Preservationists, a small but passionate faction in 1940s New York, protested the alterations. They argued that Maurice Haber's design was irreplaceable, a masterpiece of Beaux-Arts-trained architecture, and deserved protection regardless of the owner's fate. Letters were sent to editors, petitions drafted, officials implored to intervene. Almost no one responded. New York in the 1940s had little patience for nostalgia. The city was moving forward, hauling itself from depression toward the post-war boom. Old palaces were obstacles, not heirlooms. And so the mansion endured. Its marble walls, once a testament to one man's ambition, now witnessed ordinary life. The hum of conversation, the smell of cooking, the patter of children's feet. The echoing organ was gone. The great windows of the winter garden no longer framed palms or orchids, but daylight on modest kitchens and shared living rooms. Schwab's dream of permanence, of proof that a boy from Pennsylvania could rise to peer with the Vanderbilts, had been quietly rewritten. The palace had been tamed, democratized, and in doing so had found a new purpose entirely at odds with its creator's imagination. By late 1947, the Schwab mansion stood in silence, its 4 decades of tumultuous life reduced to echo and dust. The last tenants had departed, their boxes and suitcases carried out, leaving behind broken furniture, stained mattresses, and the faint evidence of ordinary lives. A child's drawing still tacked to a wall that had once displayed old masters. No servants polished the marble floors. The pipe organ was silent. The grand staircase that had witnessed presidents and industrial titans now held only emptiness. The mansion, that monument to ambition and excess, had become what it had always secretly threatened to be, a shell awaiting oblivion. Inspectors arrived to survey the property, their clipboards capturing decay in careful bureaucratic detail. Water had buckled the hardwood floors in the east wing. Plaster peeled from ceilings that had once held delicate hand-painted murals. The winter garden, stripped of its glass panels decades before, now lay open to the sky. Rain pooled across cracked stone, pulling at the earth where orchids and palms had once flourished. Every corner whispered that the building had outlived its purpose. Below, the basement bore witness to the passage of time and neglect. The swimming pool, drained long ago, held shards of cracked Italian tiles and debris. Rats had claimed the changing rooms as their own. Gymnasium equipment rusted in shadows, and the bowling alley, once a toy of Gilded Age leisure, was warped beyond recognition, pins scattered like forgotten props from a long-forgotten party. Upstairs, the ruin was quieter, but no less final. The walls, built to subdivide the mansion into apartments, had undermined structural logic. Electrical wiring, hastily installed to serve dozens of small units, posed fire hazards throughout the house. The heating system, jury-rigged to warm a patchwork of spaces rather than one great home, had corroded beyond repair. Even in decay, the mansion retained traces of its former ambition. The carved limestone facades caught the fading light of late afternoon, as if stubbornly insisting on dignity. Rusting iron gates bore the Schwab family crest, a symbol of pride that had long outlasted its relevance. From the street, the building still looked like a palace, though the illusion faltered under close scrutiny. The grandeur that once dazzled guests now seemed almost comical, a theater of excess emptied of actors. Boardrooms had decided its fate long before public notice arrived. The investors who now owned the property saw arithmetic where Schwab had once seen empire. The land, an entire city block between 73rd and 74th Streets, was worth far more than the crumbling stone above it. Notices slipped under doors informed the last residents that they must leave. There were no ceremonies, no speeches, no photographs. Life inside the house was done. The future would be built on its ruins. The city shrugged. Preservationists sent one final flurry of letters and petitions. They lamented the destruction of Maurice Haber's architectural vision, the disappearance of a rare Beaux-Arts-trained masterpiece. Their protests were polite, almost academic, and mostly ignored. New Yorkers were ready to move on. Few had ever truly loved the Schwab mansion. Few had forgiven what it represented, a Gilded Age monument to ostentation, inequality, and ambition untempered by consequence. For the first time since 1906, the building had no human rhythm. Its halls were quiet, its rooms stood empty. Dust settled on marble, filling corners that had once gleamed under polish. Shadows pooled in chandeliers that no longer held candles. The mansion waited, a frozen witness to the rise and fall of its creator, to a city that had changed around it, to a world that had long since outgrown Gilded Age fantasies. Soon, the wrecking crews would arrive. The same rooms that had hosted presidents, industrialists, and orchestras would be gutted, chopped, and reduced to rubble. The Schwab mansion, designed to proclaim the triumph of one man over circumstance, was about to become another memory in the relentless reinvention of Manhattan. Its stones, its iron, its history, all would give way to something new, practical, and utterly indifferent to the ambition that had once built it. The silence inside was absolute, and in that silence, the story of Charles Schwab's dream, its rise, its splendor, its inevitability, rested, waiting for the final act. Restoring the Schwab mansion to anything resembling its former glory was impossible. Architects and investors calculated the costs, more than building an entirely new structure from scratch. The arithmetic was merciless. For them, this was land, not legacy, a full city block along Manhattan's prime Riverside Drive, worth far more as foundation than as memory. The post-war housing boom demanded density, not monuments. Returning soldiers needed apartments. Young families needed homes. Efficiency outweighed grandeur. Architects submitted proposals. The winning design was unapologetically practical, a 15-story apartment building, more than 600 units, red brick, minimal ornamentation, every square foot optimized for middle-class life. And with a wry twist of historical irony, it would be called Schwab House. Not tribute, but shorthand. The block had long borne the Schwab name, and no one cared for sentimentality when mail and taxis relied on clarity. Charles Schwab's name would outlive the palace itself, attached not to marble staircases or pipe organs, but to apartments rented to families much like his own parents.
Preservationists tried one final time. Letters went to museums, universities, historical societies. Could the grand staircase be moved? Could the pipe organ be rescued for a concert hall? Could carved stone fragments be preserved for study? Each time the answer was the same: impossible. The cost of extraction outweighed the value of memory. The mansion would not survive in pieces.
A few artifacts trickled into the world, door handles in antique shops, limestone fragments in private gardens, perhaps a winter garden tile or two, but these were crumbs, tokens that hinted at a lost spectacle. The pipe organ itself was sold to a church in Pennsylvania, returning faintly to the state where Schwab's life had begun. But the mansion's scale, its defiant ambition, could not exist as fragments. Architecture needs context. Remove the building from its block, and it loses meaning. Demolition permits were issued in early 1948. Barriers went up. Notices warned neighbors of dust and noise. Heavy machinery rolled onto Riverside Drive, idle for a moment, waiting for the signal. Charles Schwab had been dead 9 years. Emma had been gone 9 years. No heirs remained. No family would witness what came next. The palace that had once hosted presidents and industrialists, that had poured music and laughter into its halls, would end as rubble. Inside, the story was quieter, smaller, human. A young laborer, 23 years old, entered through the servants' entrance on 73rd Street, a door almost certainly never used by the Schwabs themselves. He carried a clipboard and a pencil, sent in by his foreman to mark hazards before the wrecking ball began its work. His name is lost to history, but the fragments of his experience remain, preserved in oral accounts and a single newspaper interview. The building was immense, overwhelming, and oddly intimate from the inside. Marble columns clawing toward ceilings, grand rooms that could swallow the theater troupe, staircases wide enough to host parades. Dust coated everything. Broken plaster hung like tattered banners. The faint smell of coal and wood smoke lingered, despite decades of disuse.
He moved carefully, tracing hallways where the echo of past grandeur still hung. The winter garden was a ruin, broken glass, dirt and frost replacing orchids and palms. A billiard room that once held imported tables now smelled of mold and neglect. Every corner bore evidence of the lives once lived here, the brass fixtures of a servant's corridor, footprints pressed into dust on the marble floors, scratches from furniture moved decades earlier. Even as the mansion prepared to die, it demanded attention, respect, careful navigation. The young worker felt both awe and fear. Outside, the city continued. Cars passed along Riverside Drive, indifferent to the spectacle within. Newsreels of post-war New York, of returning veterans, of a booming metropolis blurred past the mansion's walls. To the world, it was only another old building. Inside, it was the last stage of a Gilded Age drama, a place where ambition, pride, and excess would meet their final reckoning. The wrecking ball would soon swing. Steel, stone, and glass would fall, room by room, floor by floor. Generations of labor, artisans, stonemasons, carpenters, would be erased in minutes. The mansion had survived decades of extravagance, of high society parties, of war, depression, and social change. Now it would not survive practicality. Its story, like the man who built it, was about to end in silence, dust, and rubble. And yet, inside its empty halls, traces remained. A handrail worn smooth by decades of use, the ghost of a chandelier's shadow on the marble floor, the echo of music that no longer played. For the young worker, for the crews that followed, for the city that watched with quiet approval, the mansion's last moments were both labor and reverence, a final communion with one man's impossible dream before it returned to the earth. The contrast between the plain servant's door and the world beyond stopped him cold. He stepped into a corridor, paneled in dark oak, the wood still catching a muted glow beneath decades of dust. Light filtered through grimy windows, striking carved moldings that no one had touched in years. The air carried the scent of plaster, cold stone, and something older, almost forgotten, a memory of hands and ambition, of labor and luxury entwined. He moved deeper,
his boots crunching in the settled dust. The kitchen sprawled across half the basement, vast and industrial even by 1940 standards. Iron stoves, large enough to roast entire animals, lined one wall. Copper pots, tarnished but intact, hung from racks that seemed to float toward a ceiling he could barely make out. He imagined the army of cooks and kitchen boys who once worked here, preparing feasts to feed guests who dined like kings and presidents. The scale was dizzying, more a factory for indulgence than a domestic space. Upstairs, the grand staircase rose like a vision from a fever dream. Marble steps, each wider than the hallway of his Brooklyn apartment, climbed into shadow. Iron railings twisted into leaves and vines, their artistry surviving decades of neglect. At a landing, a cracked stained glass window scattered shards of colored light across walls stripped bare of paintings. Faint rectangles in the silk damask hinted at works that had long since vanished. Ghosts of frames lingered, a silent testimony to vanished grandeur. He entered the great hall, and the room stole his breath. Even divided, scarred, emptied of furniture, music, and life, it still carried presence beyond its dimensions. Ceilings disappeared into darkness. Walls, roughened by hastily removed partitions, clung to scraps of silk damask. At the far end, the pipe organ loomed, its thousands of pipes frozen in time. Too complex to remove quickly, it stood as a silent monument, waiting for hands that would never play its keys again. The worker paused, overwhelmed. He had grown up in cramped Brooklyn rooms where a single chamber held families of 5. He had never imagined this, an entire palace built to impress, now deserted, waiting for obliteration. Room after room offered the same collision of majesty and decay. A bathroom with gold-plated fixtures tarnished green. A library with shelves soaring 20 feet, empty but grand. Bedrooms with fireplaces large enough to shelter a grown man. Mantels carved with Greek myth dulled by dust. In a small servant's room tucked under the eaves, he found a trace of the past. Initials scratched into plaster, J.M., dated 1904. A laborer from the original construction crew, like him, had left a mark, claiming a fragment of immortality. The worker hesitated, then drew his own initials beside the old ones with a pocket knife. 2 anonymous men, separated by 44 years, connected through a gesture invisible to the world. On his way out, he took a brass doorknob shaped like a lion's head. He told himself it was a simple keepsake, but he knew it was proof, a token that beauty this immense had once been real, and that he had walked these halls when stone and wood still breathed life. The next morning, the demolition began. The wrecking ball swung in slow, terrible arcs. Each impact sent stone dust billowing across Riverside Drive, coating the sidewalks and drifting over cars. The sound reverberated like thunder trapped indoors, each swing erasing decades of labor, artistry, and ambition. Marble columns cracked, iron railings bent, and ceilings splintered. The mansion's bones, once celebrated for their audacity, fell under gravity's relentless verdict. Outside, the city continued its indifferent hum. Taxi horns, streetcars, and the chatter of pedestrians went on as if the palace had never existed. Inside, the building groaned, fought, and finally yielded. Rooms that had hosted presidents, industrialists, and musicians, spaces that once echoed with laughter and music, crumbled into dust. The pipe organ trembled with the vibrations of destruction, a final note in a symphony of ruin. In those last hours, the young worker understood what history often forgets: the scale of human ambition, the impermanence of even the grandest dreams, and the quiet endurance of memory.
For a few moments he carried the palace in his mind, its oak corridors, marble staircases, and soaring halls, and left behind a single trace of his passage, a tiny bridge across time. And then, stone by stone, the Schwab mansion fell, leaving Riverside Drive quieter, emptier, and a little more ordinary than it had ever been. Each crash of the wrecking ball tore away another piece of facade, another tower, another room, rooms that had cost more to build than most families could earn in a lifetime. The workers moved with professional detachment, muscles swinging on instinct, but some paused between strikes, staring at the chateau as it crumbled. Whether they admitted it or not, they were erasing something that could never be built again, a monument to ambition, excess, and a vanished era. By spring 1948, only rubble remained. Trucks hauled away the last fragments of pink granite, the carved limestone, and shards of marble. The lot between 73rd and 74th Streets lay bare for the first time in half a century. Where towers and turrets had punctuated the skyline, there was now only open sky. Neighbors who had grown accustomed to the chateau's outline stared at the emptiness, unsettled by the sudden absence of extravagance. Construction began almost immediately. The new building rose with the stripped-down efficiency of post-war America. No hand-carved stonework, no imported blocks from European quarries, no years spent chasing an ideal of perfection. Instead, standardized red brick panels, prefabricated components, and crews working shifts to meet unyielding deadlines. The goal was simple: apartments ready for occupancy by 1950.
Schwab House climbed 15 stories above Riverside Drive, a monument of utility rather than spectacle. Its facade offered only clean lines, functional window frames, and a modest canopy above the entrance. The philosophy was clear: maximum occupancy, minimum waste, rents affordable for families who needed space more than grandeur. 620 apartments would eventually fill the building, each compact, practical, and designed for everyday living rather than impressing visitors. The contrast with its predecessor was stark. Where Schwab's mansion had sprawled horizontally, consuming a full city block and employing 50 staff to maintain appearances for 2 residents, Schwab House stacked life vertically, concentrating thousands of lives into a single volume. A handful of doormen, porters, and maintenance workers replaced the army of servants. Families now lived in spaces that averaged 4 rooms each, a fraction of the former mansion's footprint, yet vastly more populated. In 1950, the first tenants moved in: teachers from nearby schools, office workers commuting to Midtown, young couples saving for suburban homes, retirees on fixed incomes. They signed leases without knowing or particularly caring what had stood here before. Schwab House was simply an address, a place to receive mail and instruct taxi drivers, a practical shell, devoid of legacy or grandeur. Some of the older neighbors tried to preserve memory. They showed yellowing photographs of the mansion, described parties glimpsed from across the street, remembered the day the wrecking ball hit the first tower. Their stories sounded almost mythical. A 75-room chateau, a private indoor swimming pool, a pipe organ filling the great hall with music. Surely it could not have existed here. Memory thinned with surprising speed. Within a decade, the Schwab mansion had become little more than rumor. 2 decades later, even rumor blurred. Old-timers contradicted one another, dates tangled, estates merged in memory, until the real story vanished behind competing versions. The few photographs that survived depicted a structure more akin to a Loire Valley castle than anything Manhattan could imagine, and doubt crept into every recollection. Surely something so grand had never existed on Riverside Drive. Yet the land remembered.
Schwab House, practical and unassuming as it was, followed almost exactly the footprint of the mansion it had replaced. Beneath its brick and concrete, beneath the lives of thousands of ordinary New Yorkers, the shadow of the steel baron's ambition lingered, a reminder that even when memory fades, the earth itself keeps the shape of dreams, excesses, and the human desire to reach higher than the sky. The same boundaries, the same proportions, a full city block devoted to a single building. Schwab House stood quietly on Riverside Drive, an anomaly in Manhattan's tight grid of narrow lots and shared walls. Visitors unfamiliar with the site's past sometimes paused, sensing something odd in the generous spacing, the openness that felt almost too deliberate. A ghost of grandeur lingered in the geometry, a whisper of what had once occupied the block. Riverside Drive itself continued to evolve. One by one, the grand houses that had flanked Schwab's chateau vanished, replaced by apartment buildings much like Schwab House. The dream of rivaling Fifth Avenue, of creating a Hudson-side aristocracy, faded into memory and then disappeared altogether. The Upper West Side transformed into the neighborhood it is today. Intellectual, comfortably middle class, slightly bohemian, a home for professors, writers, musicians, not steel barons. Inside Schwab House, new stories quietly took root. Residents built traditions and private histories entirely independent of Charles Schwab or the Gilded Age. Children grew up in apartments first rented by their grandparents. Holiday lights returned to the same windows year after year. Friendships formed in elevators, laundry rooms, and stairwells. A community emerged, ordinary and alive, completely unaware of the palatial past beneath its feet. In that sense, the erasure was complete, not just destruction, but replacement. The mansion had been removed so thoroughly that its successor could be unremarkable, ordinary, and entirely self-contained. Schwab's dream and his name lingered only as a faint trace, like a shadow in the city's memory. In the next chapter, we attempt something impossible, reconstructing the vanished palace from scraps, fragments, and surviving traces. The research begins in the archives. You sit in the reading room of the New York Historical Society, surrounded by dusty cardboard boxes untouched for decades. Folders labeled Schwab, Charles M. yield fragments, yellowed newspaper clippings, snippets from society pages, and a few photographs that somehow survived the indifference of history. Each piece adds a stroke to the picture, but the image refuses to be complete. The mansion existed for less than 50 years and vanished before the era of obsessive documentation. Most of what remains comes from the memories of people long gone. The photographs are the most precious artifacts. Spread across the table, they form a tentative puzzle. Here is the Riverside Drive facade, towers rising against a pale winter sky. Here the grand staircase, a woman frozen mid-step in an Edwardian dress, ascending to a reception long forgotten. Here, the winter garden, palm trees impossibly lush behind glass walls. A glimpse of the great hall, the pipe organ in the background, chairs lined up for a concert that ended a century ago. Each image is both beautiful and frustrating. Photographers of the era loved formal compositions, staging grandeur while hiding small details. You can see the mansion's magnificence, but not how it felt to walk those halls, to hear footsteps echo on marble floors, to smell the damp warmth of the winter garden, to feel the vibration of the organ filling the rooms with booming music. Written sources provide fragments of context. Newspaper accounts swing between awe and skepticism. One reporter called it a poem in stone. Another dismissed it as the most expensive proof of insecurity Manhattan has ever known. Architectural journals debated Maurice Hébert's French inspirations, arguing whether his Loire Valley influences were genuine synthesis or mere imitation. Society columnists cataloged guest lists, menu courses, floral arrangements, who arrived on time and who did not. Almost no one captured ordinary life, the quiet mornings, empty afternoons, or the mood of a house when it was not performing for its audience. Reconstruction, you realize, will always be partial. The photographs, the accounts, the fragmented objects, each offers a window, never the whole experience. Yet even incomplete, these traces allow imagination to reconstruct a world lost. The scale, the ambition, the triumph and loneliness of the Schwab mansion. From memory, from research, from careful examination of shadows and fragments, the palace rises again, not in stone, but in story, in vision, and in the imagination of anyone willing to see it. The search shifts from paper to people. Descendants of servants, perhaps children of guests who might have inherited stories, become the new trail. Almost immediately, the chain goes cold. Staff scattered when the mansion became apartments. Guests are long dead, their memories buried with them. A few genealogical leads end at nursing homes and cemetery records. The human link between past and present has snapped.
And then, a small discovery. An antique dealer in Connecticut replies to a letter. He claims to own a doorknob from the Schwab mansion, brass shaped like a lion's head, purchased decades ago at an estate sale. A handwritten note accompanies it, asserting its origin. He sends photographs. The doorknob is heavy, elaborate, meant for a building designed to impress anyone who touched its doors. Whether it truly came from the mansion can never be verified. The story, however, fits. You arrange to see it in person. The doorknob rests in your hands, solid and immovable. Its brass has darkened with age, but the lines remain sharp. The mane, the stern expression, the weight and permanence. It is an object built to endure centuries, not decades. You think of the young demolition worker who might have pocketed this very piece, who etched his initials beside those of a construction laborer from 1904, a silent witness to the understanding that some fragments deserve preservation, even unseen. These pieces, small and scattered, become tools for reconstruction. You begin working with digital artists to create a three-dimensional model of the mansion, mapping photographs and surviving architectural plans into a single, unified vision. The process is painstaking. Every window placement must be verified, every roofline, every spire measured and scaled. Shadows in century-old glass plates help estimate tower heights. Slowly, pixel by pixel, the chateau begins to reassemble itself. Walls rise from grids, towers climb skyward, the winter garden stretches beneath the restored glass ceiling. The grand staircase curves elegantly back into existence. Room by room, the structure New York erased returns, not in stone, but in light, in imagination, in code. Then comes the moment that makes it real. You step outside onto the corner of 73rd and Riverside with a tablet in hand. An augmented reality app overlays the three-dimensional reconstruction onto the modern streetscape. For a heartbeat, past and present coexist. Ghostly towers pierce the sky above the current Schwab house. Terraces spread across sidewalks where pedestrians now rush by. The winter garden floats above parked cars. The effect is uncanny, unsettling, moving. For an instant, you feel Charles Schwab's ambition, the urgency, the hunger, the desire of a boy from Pennsylvania coal country to build something that would outlast him. It did not. Nothing truly does. But here, in digital light, stitched together from memory, documents, and imagination, the mansion exists again. Not as a home, not as a palace, but as a question we can finally confront. What did it mean to build so much? What does it teach us now? The digital ghost fades from your screen. You lower the tablet. Reality reasserts itself. Red brick, ordinary windows, a doorman checking his phone. Schwab House. 600 families live where one man once tried to build eternity. The lesson is obvious: hubris. Charles Schwab created a palace to proclaim victory over poverty, over social hierarchies, over anyone who had doubted him. But the triumphant monument became a cage. The larger the chateau grew, the smaller its owners seemed within it. Its walls, designed to display mastery and wealth, revealed instead fear, fragility, and a longing to fill a void no marble or gilding could mask. Yet there is another lesson, subtler, discovered in fragments, in echoes, in the faint brass of a lion's head doorknob. Legacy is not permanence. Architecture is not memory. Cities decide what survives and what vanishes. We remember selectively, erase indiscriminately. Schwab's mansion is gone, but it survives in rumor, in photos, in digital reconstruction, and in our imagination. Its story persists because we choose to keep it alive, to wonder about ambition, excess, and the fragility of human triumph. In the end, the mansion teaches more about us than Schwab, about how we measure success, about the impermanence of wealth, about the tension between memory and erasure, and about the rare moments when, for a brief instant, past and present, loss and imagination collide, and we see what once was, what might have been, and what remains in our collective story. Every new tower, every additional room was less a testament to confidence and more a monument to its absence. Schwab believed stone, marble, and glass could lock meaning in place, that if he built something grand enough, permanent enough, dazzling enough, he would matter forever. He trusted walls over stories, roofs over recollection, marble over memory. And he was wrong. The mansion lasted just 42 years, shorter than many home loans today. The stone meant to endure generations became rubble before his own had fully passed from the stage. What survived was not architecture, it was narrative. Schwab's rise and fall, the dizzying parties, the gambling, the slow unraveling of fortune, the mayor's cold refusal, and the relentless swing of the wrecking ball. These sequences persist, vivid and cinematic, long after every trace of the building vanished. The mansion now exists only as story, rebuilt in imagination rather than stone, carried forward from researcher to writer to viewer. Perhaps this is the only immortality any of us truly achieves. The Gilded Age produced hundreds of palaces, and most are gone. A few remain as museums, the Vanderbilt's Newport Estates, the Frick on Fifth Avenue, saved because someone, at some point, they were worth preserving. The Schwab mansion was not. It was erased so completely that even its ghost struggles to find space. And yet, in our minds, we return to Riverside Drive.
We hold yellowed photographs, overlaid digital reconstructions, imagine towers that no longer rise, terraces that no longer catch the light. The house survives because we choose to remember it. Memory is not passive, it is labor. It is the deliberate act of carrying some stories forward while letting others fade into the silence of history. Charles Schwab wanted permanence in stone. He achieved something different. He is remembered not for what endured, but for what vanished, an ambition swallowed by time. And in that disappearance lies the sharper lesson, the question that echoes across every fortune, every monument, every desperate attempt to immortalize oneself. What remains when the stone is gone? The answer is not marble, nor gold, nor walls. It is story. And stories, if we keep telling them, can outlast everything else.